One of the quiet myths about the medieval world is that people survived on little more than bread and luck. That assumption comes from reading history backward, through the lens of modern abundance. Medieval farmers did not farm narrowly because they were ignorant. They farmed broadly because, they understood failure. Weather failed, lords failed, armies failed, trade failed. And when those systems collapsed, honestly, the only thing that mattered was what still grew in the soil. What has been largely forgotten is that medieval agriculture was not optimized for profit or uniformity. It was optimized for endurance. Many of the vegetables that sustained medieval populations were not impressive by modern standards. They were slow, bitter, awkward to harvest, or just visually unimpressive. But they survived cold springs, poor soils, disrupted labor, and, even years of neglect. They were insurance crops in an age without insurance. The disappearance of these vegetables is not a story of progress replacing inefficiency. It is a story of resilience being traded for convenience. And honestly, that trade is worth re-examining. Medieval farmers grew for survival first because they expected disruption, not stability. Medieval Europe existed in a near-constant state of uncertainty. Climate fluctuations shortened growing seasons. War removed laborers from fields or destroyed crops outright. Disease reduced livestock, cutting off manure supplies that fertilized soil. Markets could collapse overnight, so farmers responded by spreading risk across many species rather than betting everything on a single staple. Vegetable diversity in medieval times wasn't really about culinary experimentation. It was, in fact, a defensive strategy. Many medieval vegetables were chosen precisely because they tolerated poor soil, regenerated themselves, or could remain edible in the ground long after harvest season had ended. Honestly, these traits mattered far more than taste or yield when survival was the ultimate goal. Skirret was, at one time, a respected root crop all across northern Europe. It produced clusters of long, sweet roots that grew deep enough to avoid frost damage. Unlike grains, skirret could actually be harvested incrementally throughout the winter, which reduced dependence on stored food that might spoil or even be seized. Its decline, interestingly, came not from failure, but from inconvenience. Skirret resists mechanized harvesting and, requires manual labor. In medieval conditions, that was perfectly acceptable, but in industrial systems it became expendable. Good King Henry, on the other hand, survived because it required almost nothing from the farmer. It was a perennial green that returned year after year without any replanting. It grew near homes, along paths, and in waste ground, often thriving in soil that had already been exhausted by other crops. Its leaves, shoots, and seeds were all edible. This plant, Good King Henry, really functioned as a quiet safety net. When annual crops failed or labor was unavailable, it still managed to produce food. Its disappearance, you see, coincided with the rise of weed eradication and monoculture farming, where anything that grew uninvited was simply removed, even if it fed people. Parsnips, for example, filled calorie gaps long before potatoes ever reshaped European diets. Before the widespread adoption of the potato, parsnips were actually one of the most important root vegetables in colder regions. They tolerated frost, improved in flavor after a bit of winter cold, and could remain in the ground until needed. Parsnips provided sugars and bulk calories when grain stores thinned. In years of scarcity, they were often more reliable than bread. Their gradual replacement reflects changing food preferences, not nutritional inferiority. Fat hen blurred the line between crop and wild food, and that was its strength. Fat hen, also known as lamb's quarters, was both cultivated and foraged. It thrived in disturbed soils created by ploughing, construction, or flood. Medieval farmers did not view it as a weed, but as an opportunistic food source. Its leaves rival spinach nutritionally, and its seeds could be ground into flour. During famine years, fat hen quietly supplemented diets when formal crops failed. Modern agriculture eliminated it in pursuit of control, removing a plant that once required no deliberate planting at all. Sea beet anchored coastal food security when inland supplies failed. Sea beet grew along coastlines and salt marshes, tolerating saline soils that ruined most crops. Coastal communities relied on it when inland trade routes were disrupted by war or weather. Its repeated harvesting did not kill the plant, allowing continuous use. Sea beet reduced reliance on imported grain, a strategic advantage during sieges and blockades. Its domesticated descendants survive, but the original plant's resilience has largely been bred out. Smallage mattered because bitterness once signaled usefulness, not failure. Smallage, the wild ancestor of celery, was more bitter and aromatic than modern varieties. Medieval cooks valued it for its preservative qualities and digestive benefits, especially in diets heavy on grains and salted meat. Its medicinal reputation reinforced its role in kitchen gardens. When breeding focused on mildness and texture, smallage lost favour. What was lost was not flavour, but hardiness. Alexanders thrived because they tolerated neglect during social collapse. Alexanders grew tall and strong with minimal care. It self-seeded aggressively and produced edible leaves, stems, roots, and seeds. Monasteries favoured it because it required little attention and provided multiple harvests. In periods of plague or war, when labour shortages were severe, plants like Alexanders were more reliable than demanding annual crops. Their disappearance reflects a shift toward farming systems that assume constant human input. Rampions succeeded where soil fertility was already exhausted. Rampions produced edible roots and leaves in poor soils that could no longer support demanding crops. They did not require heavy manuring, which was critical when livestock numbers dropped. Their cultivation declined as agricultural inputs increased, but in medieval conditions, rampions represented a practical response to land degradation. Turnips were human survival food before they became animal feed. Medieval turnips were smaller, tougher, and faster growing than modern varieties. They could be planted late and still produce a harvest. When early crops failed, turnips often filled the gap. Their later association with livestock feed reflects abundance, not original purpose. In lean years, turnips were human food first. Chard endured because it ignored rigid growing seasons. Chard tolerated heat, cold, and partial shade. It resisted bolting and could be harvested repeatedly across seasons. Medieval households valued it because it smoothed the gaps between harvests. Food continuity mattered more than peak yield. Chard's survival into modern gardens is one of the few unbroken threads from medieval vegetable culture. Salsify reached deep when surface soils failed. Salsify and its relatives grew long roots that accessed nutrients deep in the soil. This made them resistant to drought and surface depletion. Their slow growth discouraged theft, which was, an unspoken advantage in unstable times. They disappeared largely because they did not align with fast production cycles, not because they lacked value. Cabbage endured because it was preservation, not preference. Medieval cabbages were tougher and more bitter, but they stored well and fermented easily. Fermentation was not tradition, it was survival technology. Cabbage could be preserved without fuel, salt in large quantities, or complex tools. Its continued presence in modern diets reflects its original role as a food that could outlast seasons and sieges alike. The loss of these vegetables reflects a shift away from resilience as a priority. These vegetables were abandoned not because they failed, but because modern systems prioritized efficiency, uniformity, and transportability. Medieval farmers prioritized survival under pressure. Diversity was insurance. Perennials reduced labor risk. Bitter plants signaled nutrition and medicinal value. The medieval approach assumed disruption. the modern approach assumes continuity. Remembering medieval food systems matters because instability is not a historical anomaly. Studying these vegetables is not about returning to the past. It is about recovering strategies that worked when systems broke down. Medieval farmers were not backward. They were cautious, adaptive, and deeply aware of risk. As climate volatility and supply chain fragility increase, the lessons embedded in these forgotten crops become harder to ignore. Understanding what people grew to survive tells us as much about history as any battle or treaty. If you value serious, grounded analysis that looks beyond rulers and wars to the systems that kept societies alive, consider subscribing to Iron Age Instincts, and if this perspective added depth to how you think about resilience and preparedness, share it with someone who values history that still matters.